I'm not sure that this is my story to tell. It was a story I heard from my father, and it was a story he heard from his father before that. It has affected us all, I guess. That's why I feel some ownership over the tale I'm about to share. It's followed our family for 3 generations. My grandfather was a hunter. He had a reputation. The best furs in Wyoming all had my family name attached to them. That reputation earned my grandfather some pretty historic invites. He met the vice president once. The invite at the center of my story, however, brought him to Yellowstone National Park. Nowadays, when you hear the name Yellowstone, it's attached to an idea of beauty, a scenic lake, hot geysers, and a slumbering volcano. That wasn't the case in the late 1950s. Mismanagement of the park and its fauna led to overpopulation and overgrazing. The vegetation was being stripped bare. Elk were especially problematic. The park district invited a few hunters to come into Yellowstone and deal with the elk. Hunting was permitted in Yellowstone at the time, so the act wasn't particularly surprising. It was the amount of death that shook the park district and jeopardized its relationship with the public. In the end, over 5,000 elk were killed. It was called an extermination. My grandfather was a part of that. His story wasn't about the elk, though. His story was about the thing that came out of Yellowstone chasing all that death. My grandfather had positioned himself in a clearing. He climbed a deer tower and enjoyed a 360-degree view of the area. It was only a matter of time before an elk came along. He missed his mark and hit the deer in the backside. The gunshot scared any other wildlife out of the area, and the injury wasn't enough to put the elk down. My grandfather decided to give chase. He followed the trail of blood through Yellowstone. Strangely enough, it seemed the elk had led him back to a larger herd. Branches were trampled and the foliage was eaten bare. My grandfather slowed down. He was more interested in surveying the massive herd than he was in pursuing the single elk he'd hit. He was careful and quiet in the way that only hunters can be. When all the tracks he was following began to converge, he was certain that the herd of elk was waiting for him just through the next tree line. He pushed forward. When his vision penetrated the wall of chewed greenery, he came upon something else. There were no elk. There were signs that they had slept there. There were more grazing patterns and tracks around the perimeter, but there were no elk. It appeared that the herd had gathered there, walked tirelessly in a circle, and then vanished. He returned the rifle to his back and began to investigate. When the sound of a snapping tree branch came from nearby, he looked. He saw what looked like an elk's rack shifting among the trees. Then came its face, the head of a large bull with deep, dark eyes set in the back of its skull. My grandfather described this part better than me. He said the animal, while its body was still obscured by the forest, looked into him. He said those dark eyes glimpsed his soul. He described the light changing overhead, as time seemed to blur, and he became snared by the gaze of the animal. Eventually, the elk came forward. What stepped out of the tree line was no living animal. Below the neck, the elk's body was gaunt. Its fur was matted and patchy. When it entered the den, it stood upright. It stood at least 12 feet tall, as my grandfather described it. When it shifted and lurched, he could see its tight skin dragging against its bones underneath. He said he felt it judge him. He heard a voice in his head, something that challenged the very purpose that had brought him there. He said, looking at the beast, that he knew immediately that he needed to stop killing. My grandfather told my dad that he knew immediately hunting would lead him down the same emaciated path that had starved this creature. He said he knew he would become something like the monster he was staring at. Then, according to my grandfather, the beast wandered back into the woods. There were no elk left there for it to consume, he said. It moved on to find a meal elsewhere. My grandfather only killed a dozen elk that season. Out of the 5,000 total, 12 isn't very many. The monster he saw forgave him for that dozen. My family hasn't picked up a gun since. My father swore that he'd never touch a firearm, and I had no reason to. The hunting itch was out of our blood by then. We all know of the monster, though. We've all had that creature described to us with such detail that we never once considered going back on my grandfather's words. We all understand that lifting another rifle, taking another life, will invite whatever curse had deformed that thing. Then it will be us wandering in the woods, searching for our own kind. We never heard of any other sightings. None of the other hunters who came out of Yellowstone were changed in the same way as my grandfather. That massacre would lead to widespread change in the park district, though. Maybe there was enough death there to scare the hunters, even without the glimpse of that creature to motivate them. I hear that Yellowstone is beautiful now. Like I said earlier, it's all geysers and lake beds now. I think I'd like to see it. I'd like to see the place where life was able to grow back. But the last thing I want to see is that creature. What if it decides it isn't looking for elk anymore? What if it decides that letting my family go was a mistake? I was out driving in the Australian Outback in December of 2011 when the most intense day of my life occurred. I was on a deserted road and was headed to my camping destination when I saw a massive creature walking towards my car. It was about the size of a large dog, and when I say large, I mean like an English Mastiff, but at the same time didn't look exactly like a dog. It had brown fur and walked on two legs like a human, and it moved fast. It was looking right at me like it had a purpose, or an agenda with me. Of course, I was terrified and wondered why this thing was focused on me and thought about what it was going to do to me. Was going to kill me or what? But to my surprise, it just walked right by my car with that same intense look on its face. I mean, it was definitely on a mission of some sort. It was an absolutely surreal experience and something I'll never forget. Strangely akin to what it must be like being on a safari, where the most amazing creatures walk right by you, like you're invisible. Or maybe it's that they're just used to you. And right when I thought I was safe, the creature turned around and looked right at me again. This time its eyes were so intense, and I felt like it could see my soul. But after a few seconds, it just turned away again and continued walking off. I sat there in my car for a good while, trying to make sense of what I had just seen and wondering why it had come at me twice. Bottom line is that I felt lucky to be alive, but also super confused. What was that thing, and why did it just walk by me without doing anything? It was for sure some creature that isn't officially cataloged. I mean, I'm in the Outback a lot, and I've never seen this thing in any official book, or whatever. I figured that there must be someone who would know more about this, but I wasn't planning to be back in civilization for a few days, so I would just have to wait. So once I got to my campsite and set up everything, all I could do was sit around my campfire and think about what I had seen. As for what it looked like, I don't think there are enough words to truly describe it. It's something you have to see for yourself to believe. But I will tell you that it had an eerie, almost human-like face and gave me the heebie-jeebies, and its arms were really long and muscular, almost like a gorilla's. So the truth is that the encounter got in my head pretty bad, and I had a hard time sleeping that night. And the next morning it was still eating away at me, so I decided to pack up and head back to where I could ask someone about what I saw. I decided that it would be best to go to the police and tell them what I saw, figuring that they would be the first to hear reports of these things and know more about them. But when I got there, they just looked at me with a confused look on their face. They said that I had probably seen a dingo, which is an Australian wild dog. But I know what I saw, and it was nothing like any normal-sized dog. And you know what else? As I was walking out of that station, I noticed one of the officers who listened to my story writing something down very purposely. I still have a weird feeling about seeing him writing like that. It's almost like he really did believe me and was keeping notes. Like maybe they have a special file or something that's off the record. Anyway, it's hard to describe what I feel like now and what it felt like to experience all of that. But it was almost like the creature was intelligent and aware of me, very human-like. And I also got the feeling that it knew I was scared. Maybe that's why it just continued walking. Who knows? And I'm sorry my thoughts are all over the place. It's just difficult to get it all out in one perfect stream. As I talk about it, lots of bits and pieces of the day come flying back into my memory. Anyway, I've been doing a lot of thinking and looking online about this thing, and I still can't find anything that looks even remotely like the creature I saw. So, if anyone out there knows something about this, or has had a similar experience, especially if you're from Australia, please let me know. I feel like I'm carrying this secret with me and need to talk to someone about it. I've been a park ranger at Redwood National and State Parks in California for over 15 years now. Growing up, I always felt a deep connection to nature. I suppose it was only natural that I'd make a career out of it. After college, I decided to go through the rigorous training to become a park ranger. I wanted to protect the land that had given me so much, and I wanted to share its wonders with others. My colleagues often joked about my sixth sense for the forest. Maybe it was because I spent so much time out there, but I often knew when something was amiss. A change in the weather, an unusual animal behavior, or even a misplaced rock. I seemed to notice it all. They'd laugh, but I took pride in that connection. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of injured animals, lost hikers, and minor mishaps, but nothing ever shook me to the core like the encounter I'm about to tell you about. It was a reminder that no matter how familiar you become with a place, there's always something unknown lurking just out of sight. It was a clear but slightly chilly night. The moon was out, and there was a gentle breeze that rustled the towering redwoods. I had just started my nightly patrol, working the late shift like I often do. Everything was calm, and I planned to follow my usual route through the Tall Trees Grove Trail. It's typically quiet at night, with only the sound of the forest and maybe a distant owl calling. I had my flashlight and my radio to keep me company. As I got deeper into the forest that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It's not like I hadn't walked this path 100 times before, but something in the air was different. I thought I heard a faint rustling in the distance, and the wind carried a smell I just couldn't place. It wasn't a normal forest smell, it was something more ominous. As I continued down the path, that terrible smell became more pronounced, almost like rotting meat. It was a stench that filled the air, something between death and decay. The kind of smell that sticks in your nostrils and turns your stomach. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a dead animal somewhere off the trail, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. The night was unusually still, and that's when I heard it. A cracking noise behind me, like branches breaking underfoot, followed by a strange whistling sound that seemed to echo through the trees. I turned, my heart pounding, and shone my flashlight into the darkness. That's when I saw it. The creature was standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight, hidden in the shadows, but definitely there. Its antlers were twisted and gnarled, protruding from what looked like a deer's skull, but there was something terribly wrong about it. The face was more like a human skull with two hollow holes where the eyes should have been, and yet glowing yellow from those depths were eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. The body was a grotesque combination of animal and something more. The legs looked like they belonged to a deer, or maybe an elk, but the skin was deteriorating off the bones, revealing a sickening skeleton beneath. Rotting flesh hung in tatters, and I could almost hear the sound of it decaying. The creature's height was alarming, easily 9 feet tall, and its presence was overwhelming. But perhaps the most terrifying thing was the sense of intelligence in those glowing eyes. It wasn't just an animal. Something about it seemed almost human. Its gaze was fixed on me, not in the way a predator looks at prey, but with an unsettling curiosity, as if it was studying me. I stood there, my body frozen in fear, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The smell of rotting flesh was now mixed with the cold, damp earth, and every instinct in me was screaming to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. It was a nightmarish vision that seemed to reach into the very core of my being, challenging everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I was frozen for what felt like an eternity, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Then the creature took a step towards me, and I snapped back to reality. I reached for my radio, all the while keeping my eyes on the creature, but it simply turned and vanished into the forest. I immediately called the sighting into headquarters, my voice shaking as I described what I had seen. I was told to return to base, and I didn't need to be told twice. I made my way back, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, but the creature was gone. After reaching base, I filled out an official report and met with my supervisor. We decided to keep the incident quiet for now, to avoid unnecessary panic, but we both knew something had to be done. I'd recommend increasing patrols in the area and perhaps bringing in some experts to investigate. It's essential to figure out what this creature is and if it poses a threat to the park or its visitors. In the meantime, all rangers should be made aware of the sighting and take appropriate precautions. It might sound crazy, but what I saw was real, and I think it's something we need to take seriously. If nothing else, let's at least try to figure out what that horrible smell was. Maybe it's a clue to understanding what this thing is. Either way, I'll never forget those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness of the redwoods. It's a night I'll remember for the rest of my life. They live underground. That's why they've been able to remain hidden for so long. At least that's what the wildlife officer told me before he sent me home that night. I asked him why he was telling me all this, and he just laughed and said, because it's true and nobody's going to believe you anyway. Even if you spent your entire life collecting evidence, it will just be another hoax. An urban legend. Believe me, he said, people have tried. And that was that. I went back home. I tried to forget the events of that weekend, but it's been 20 years and I still remember it like it was yesterday. And the officer was right. Everyone I've ever told this story to wrote me off as crazy, but I'll let you be the judge. I was on a guided pack rafting trip in the Yukon. That's the westernmost and smallest territory in Canada for those of your listeners who don't know. The place was so remote that we had to be dropped off by a bush pilot. Our guide was an experienced rafter, but was new to the area. Maybe not the ideal situation, but the travel expenses put us a bit over budget, and this guide was a little cheaper than some of the others we looked at. I learned later from someone local to the area that there are just some places in the Yukon that you don't go. They wouldn't say why, but at that point they didn't have to, and I didn't think to ask. The experienced guides in the area all knew to be wary. Our guide, being new, didn't. And let me tell you, it made for the adventure of our lives. Our trip was a 5-day, 4-night river run. It was through some of the most rugged areas of the Yukon Territory, places you couldn't get to on foot. You could only see this land by water or by air. We all thought of ourselves as adventurous types, but this was something else. Something much more intense. When you get that deep in the wilderness, you feel so small, so insignificant, and completely at the mercy of whatever nature feels like giving you. It wasn't until the second night of 4 that we realized there was something odd going on. By that point, most of us in the party could feel like there was something watching us, following us, but we had no real reason nor any evidence to prove the fact. It was just a strange feeling. I remember going to bed that night in my tent worried that we weren't alone. I was woken up that night at around 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. I crawled out of my tent, thinking someone in our party must have been cold or perhaps hungry during the night, but that wasn't the case. In fact, I was the last of us to get out of bed. Everyone else was already up, and they were all fixated on the glowing fire from across the river. At first glance, I thought it was a wildfire starting, but I quickly realized that wasn't the case. We could see shadows moving in front of the flames. Human shadows. There were people over there. I asked the guide if he knew of any other rafting parties in the area. I was hopeful that he would be able to explain it all away and we could go back to sleep. We watched the people on the other side of the river for what seemed like ages. They were too far away to get a really good look, but they didn't appear to be another hiking party. I didn't want to be the first one to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. They looked like Neanderthals. I didn't have a logical explanation for it. None of us did. They were gone by morning, or seemed to be gone. We didn't see them at all during the day. But with the wilderness surrounding us, concealing themselves wouldn't be terribly difficult. We rotated sleeping schedules that night so someone would be awake to keep watch. But even with our precautions, we had yet another encounter. We didn't see them that night, but they were there. All night they circled our camp. We knew because we heard them banging sticks together, banging rocks, making sounds all around to make us know they had us surrounded. And yet, they didn't approach. We built a fire at the center of our camp and kept it burning high throughout the night. I don't think they wanted a confrontation, but they were definitely trying to scare us out of their territory. And it was working. They followed us all the way downriver to our rendezvous site with our pilot. They never engaged with us, but they made certain that we knew they were there and that there were more of them than there were of us. The guy didn't know what to think either. I can't tell you how relieved we all were when we saw the bush plane flying in to get us. We stopped at one of the park's Canada centers on our way out and told them everything that happened. The girl at the counter looked at us like we were crazy, but that's when I had the chance to talk to one of the wildlife officers. In the most casual tone I've ever heard, he told me that there are wild people up there in the north. And he added that they don't like outsiders too much. I said I thought they looked like Neanderthals, like a whole other species. The officer just shrugged his shoulders and said, maybe. He didn't exactly know. He said that it would be pretty hard to study them when you're getting arrows flung your way, and that it would be best to just leave them alone. There aren't many left, and they aren't harming anyone. Despite everyone in our rafting party having the same story, nobody believed us when we got back home. We would tell our story to cold receptions from family and friends who weren't there. So we all just stopped trying. I have to say, the officer was right about one thing. Nobody did believe us, and it was a waste of time trying to convince them. Thank God we have each other. I'll never forget that day. It was September, and the leaves were just starting to turn those bright autumn colors. I was in Park County, Indiana. It's famous for its old covered bridges, many of which were built in the late 1800s. I've always liked these old bridges. They have interesting stories too, so I wanted to see them in person. There are 31 of them in total. They're set among hills and little creeks, each one with its own story. Each bridge had its own character, something a history buff like me really appreciates. On that day, the sun was setting, turning the sky red and gold. I was walking along a trail, checking out the Mecca-covered bridge. It one of the bridges that was built in the late 1800s. It was about a mile east of town, and it was the last on my list that day. It was peaceful, just the sound of leaves rustling and birds now and then. Looking at the bridge's peeling paint and old wood, I suddenly felt uneasy. Everything got really quiet, and even the wind stopped. I looked around, feeling a bit suspicious. Then something caught my eye, a glimpse of dark fur disappearing into the woods at the end of the bridge. I couldn't tell how big it was from that far, but it wasn't small, maybe as big as a bear. It seemed out of place. I don't think that it's common to see bears around here. I was curious, though, wondering if that's what I really saw, so I decided to check it out. As I got closer to where I saw it, my heart started beating faster. Even the air felt like it got darker and heavier around me. The smell in the woods changed too, a weird mix of burnt charcoal and something metallic. It was weird to say the least. I started hearing noises as I got closer. The noises were loud and they descended on the quiet woods like distant thunder, sending a flock of birds rocketing out of the trees above. There were growls and a chilling howl echoed. I should have run, but curiosity pulled me deeper into the woods along a trail, well, more of a rustic path through the trees that I had found at the end of the bridge. As I ventured deeper, it suddenly got colder, giving me the chills, even though it had been warm all day. I paused, I was sweating, and my heart was racing. There, between a cluster of trees about 50 feet away, in the fading light, I saw it. This dark and totally nightmarish thing. It had the appearance of a canine, extraordinarily large and unnerving, perched casually with an air of dominance. Hunched over, it still looked like it could tower over me if it stood up. It almost blended into the shadows of the undergrowth. It was all pretty scary, but its eyes freaked me out the most. They were like glowing coals in the dim light. Those eyes, glowing in the dark, seemed to pin me in place. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the creature blinked out of sight. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, like a ghost. I was so scared. I couldn't move for what seemed like forever. My knees trembled under the weight of what I'd witnessed. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew. After a while, I managed to get enough nerve to check out where it had been. I combed the forest floor for signs of its existence, but found nothing. No prints, no broken branches, nothing at all. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake off the encounter. I kept trying to rationalize it, pin it on fatigue, blame it on the low light, but every time I closed my eyes, I would see those burning red eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, day or night. Had it been real, or was it a result of shadows playing tricks on my mind? Telling some locals wasn't the best idea. They laughed it off as a hellhound, some local legend. They called it a devil's dog, a phantom coated in dark fur with eyes that burned like coal. No physical traces were ever left behind, and the mere sighting of one was known to induce dread in the heart of the viewer. Listening to this, I couldn't help but feel a cold shiver creep along my spine. Were these just campfire stories to scare people, or was there something more to it? Could a creature like that really roam these forests, and was I the one to see it? To this date, I'm unsure of what I saw that evening in the woods. Maybe it was the hellhound. Maybe it was simply my mind playing tricks. Either way, I will never forget those vividly burning eyes. The feeling of being watched that evening is something I can't shake off. And ever since that day, despite my love for history and the rustic charm of the bridges, I haven't returned to Park County. The memory of those ominous red eyes a deterrent too potent to overlook.